friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is really the end of the lecture that pertains to the end of 2 Kings, roughly chapters 9 through 25. I want to give you a brief overview of what you can expect in this lecture before diving into the material. I want to first provide sort of a walkthrough or a brief summary or an outline of the remainder of 2 Kings, chapters 9 through 25. I'm going to spend some time talking about the various threats, geopolitical threats to the Holy Land that 2 Kings, this portion of 2 Kings gives witness to. I'm going to provide a few focus points or places where you might want to dig in deeper and then offer a few reading strategies. To begin, I wanted to give you a sense of the whole, if you will, a sort of an overview of this portion of 2 Kings. Because as I'll mention several times in this lecture, this material can be a little bit difficult to follow, a little bit difficult to engage. And so providing a brief outline, I think, will be one helpful step in the direction of understanding. So the first place to begin is in chapters 9 and 10, which really focuses on King Jehu, who rules over Israel. And Jehu is interesting because of the role that he plays in combating the influence of previous kings, but also the portrait of him and his relationship to the prophets at the time and so forth. In chapters 11 and 12, we learn about Joash, who is ruling in Judah. In chapters 13 through 16, you get this collection of what I would take to be sort of short lists of kings and their accomplishments, basically alternating between kings in the north and kings in the south. In chapter 16, we learn about Ahaz in Judah. And this is, in some ways, a turning point in the narrative because Judah has typically been portrayed as righteous, as more likely than not going to have a righteous king, as opposed to the north, where the kings tend to be deemed to be wicked or evil. Ahaz in chapter 16 is a king in Judah who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. In chapter 17, we learn of the threat of Assyria to the northern kingdom of Israel, that eventually results in the defeat of Israel and the resettling or repatriatizing of the capital Samaria. In chapters 18 through 19, we learn of Hezekiah and his reign in Judah. Hezekiah is known for preventing the invasion of another geopolitical group and also for some significant reforms in the land of Judah. In chapter 21, we learn of more evil kings in Judah. In chapters 22 and 23, we learn of Josiah, a righteous king, another king who is going to put in place some reforms, some significant religious reforms in the land of Judah. In chapters 23 and 24, again, the pendulum swings to evil kings, wicked kings, again in Judah. And now there is this looming threat of Babylon, another sort of global superpower that seems to be knocking at the doors of Judah and the kingdom. In chapter 25, we learn of the fall of Judah, the captivity of Judah, as well as the installation of Gedaliah as the governor of Judah. Effectively, this is the end of the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel has fallen years before. Now Judah has fallen. This is the beginning of what we would refer to as the Babylonian exile. Thinking about this whole material, it's worth noting that at sometimes it seems as though the narrative slows down and it sort of zeroes in on a particular king because of his wickedness, usually, or because of his righteousness, occasionally. You will notice that Jehu there are a number of notable kings, including Jehu, who, I sort of read the story of Jehu, and I'm not sure, is this guy righteous or not? Yes, he's undoing the influence of Ahab and Jezebel, but he's also very violent. There's the story of Ahaz. Again, the narrative sort of begins to turn with Ahaz. It's maybe the beginning of the end. Then there's Hezekiah, who holds off this invasion, but really can't prevent the inevitable. and Josiah, who discovers the law and institutes these reforms. These are so it's a notable narrative. It can be hard to follow in places, but these particular kings, these particular personalities, really rise to the fore. With that broad overview in mind, I want to just talk briefly about the various threats that are introduced in this portion of Second Kings. Very often, the narrator of Second Kings will simply introduce these geopolitical rivals with very little introduction or commentary. They sort of just show up on the scene and then do their work and then disappear. It can be difficult to follow. So here are a summary of the various nation groups that you're going to encounter in your reading of the end of Second Kings. The first is Aram. We've already read about Aram earlier in the narrative, or the Arameans. They are really the first challengers to Israel and Judah. In chapter 13, Israel has some success claiming cities that had previously been lost to Aram. The next superpower, if we will, is Assyria. Assyria enters the picture in chapter 16 during the rule of Ahaz in Judah. Ahaz, it seems, makes a political and even religious alliance with King Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria. And this alliance seems to be formed because of Aram and Israel sort of combining forces to join in war on Judah, in addition to the expulsion of some Judeans from Edom. Assyria is portrayed as a worthy political ally for Judah. Eventually, Assyria will take a significant role in the north. Under the rule of Shalmaneser, Israel becomes a vassal state and eventually is exiled and Samaria is resettled. Sennacherib is the Assyrian king who invades Judah, but is ultimately turned back because of Hezekiah's prayer. So Assyria is a significant group in the landscape of Second Kings. Finally, there is Babylon. In chapter 24, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is noted. Nebuchadnezzar and his armies makes Judah his servant, or a vassal state, for 3 years. After 3 years of this state, Judah rebels, and the king of Babylon sends Chaldeans, Arameans, Ammonites, and Moabites to destroy Judah. Eventually, Jerusalem is captured, and a new king, Zedekiah, is installed by Babylon. For all intents and purposes, this starts the Babylonian exile, although scholars note that there were probably 2 waves of displacement from Judah. When it comes to the question of how to focus in on this material, I have some suggestions. So the first thing to note is that although it is only 16 chapters of material, which is relatively doable, although a lot, it can be tedious reading in places. Some of the names of the kings sound very familiar to one another, and so it can be very hard to keep track of where you're at in the narrative, or which king is which king, and so forth. And the back and forth narrative between Israel and Judah and Israel can also make it hard to follow in places. So, of course, you are welcome to read all 16 chapters and do your best to make the sense out of the details and the different narrative details. Or, if you want, you can focus in on a couple of places. And so the first place I would encourage you to focus in is on chapters 9 and 10 with Jehu and what I would call the ambiguity of his character. I'm not sure if the narrator knows whether or not Jehu is right or evil in the sight of the Lord. He certainly takes violent action against Jezebel and Ahab, but I'm not sure if I feel like it's too much violence. So I'm eager to hear from you. Next, you can focus in on Ahaz, Hoshea, and the Assyrians in chapters 16 and 17. Take a look at Ahaz's gamble with Assyria, as well as Assyria's dominance in Israel to the north and the eventual fall of the northern kingdom. Next, you might focus on chapters 18 through 23, which features Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. In many ways, this section is the best of the best and the worst of the worst as it comes to the kings of Israel and Judah. Notice Hezekiah and Isaiah's relationship. Isaiah mentioned here is likely a reference to the prophet Isaiah, who we'll read at another section of the class. Pay attention as well to Josiah's rediscovery of the law of Moses and his efforts to reinstitute the celebration of the Passover. But you can't read this material and not wonder if it's not a little bit too little, too late. It seems like the narrative arc has already taken its turn. And then finally, you can focus in on chapters 24 and 25, the fall of Judah. Notice how the pendulum has swung now with the kings of Judah, and the majority of them are doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord. So if you follow those suggestions, you would try to read chapters 9 and 10, and then chapters 16 through 25. So it's a little bit less material, but it's still going to be a challenge. So do your best to read through it. Take note of your questions and your experiences of doing so. I want to offer a few thoughts about reading strategies for this material. The first thing concerns the theological perspective of 2 Kings. In my mind, this comes through so clearly in this section of 2 Kings. For example, see the long list, the long theological rationale given for the fall of the northern kingdoms in 2 Kings 17, 7 through 23. And as you engage that portion and other portions of 2 Kings, I invite you to reflect on and perhaps even wrestle with this theological perspective. In my mind, there are a number of ways that we might think about this theological perspective. We might suggest that, hindsight is always 20/20. So if this is written from the context of exile, the author of 2 Kings is simply trying to make sense out of recent events, traumatic events at that, including the destruction of Jerusalem and its sacred temple. Or we can think through this in the lens of theodicy, the question of evil, the question of why do good things happen to good people? And the answer then would be kind of straightforward. God is simply punishing Israel for their sins. Fine, we all know they're wicked people anyways, right? Israel in the north, those kings have always been wicked. But what about God's favorite, the kingdom of Judah? What about God's promise to David? What about the Benjamites? It seems as though no one is off the hook, so punishment is justified. Another way to wrestle with this is the focus is so much on the kings. What about the common people? Are they innocent pawns in this great game between Israel and Judah's leaders and God? And finally, you might think, is punishment the only or the best response to wickedness? Is there another option in your mind or in the biblical tradition? The second reading strategy would concern Hezekiah and Josiah. They appear as bright lights among a bunch of dim or dark bulbs. Why is this? What do you think about these kings? What is it that makes them so desirable or commendable in the eyes of 2 Kings or in your own eyes? I'm sure that there are more questions that are raised by this lecture than answers or guidance given, but I do hope that it will help you engage this material from 2 Kings effectively, and I look forward to hearing your own thoughts and your own perspectives. Now, happy reading.